Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to the final scene of the Bacchae. Let's ruin some people's days. Yay! So, as always, we'll do a brief summary of what actually happened in the scene, followed by some discussion of those happenings. And also, as always, I am not an expert, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, and also some thinky thoughts of your own. Because, hey, it's literature. I mean, people might argue that there's only one interpretation, but, like, there's probably more than one interpretation. So, let's get right to it with that summary. Agave enters! Don't forget, she is, in fact, Pentheus' mother, sister to Dionysus' mother, and probably one of the reasons why Dionysus' mother got zapped. Well, Dionysus is paying her back now because Agave is carrying with her the head of her own son Pentheus, whom she thinks is the head of a lion cub that she hunted, and she's very proud of the fact that she hunted this lion cub with her own bare hands. In fact, the chorus happily goads her on until Cadmus enters, and suddenly we remembered this is in fact a tragedy, and there are people that we kind of liked who aren't doing okay. Cadmus enters with the rest of Pentheus' body, which he's collected piece by piece, because he came down from the dancing, found out his daughters killed his grandson, and had to go back to find the rest of his body. He can't find Pentheus' head though, and oh, would you look, his daughter's carrying it around, very happy. Agave continues to brag about how Cadmus would be so proud of his daughters for being such great huntresses, and Cadmus unfortunately is forced to talk her out of her own madness and make her recognize the truth, that she killed her own son, and is carrying his head around. Yeah. Okay, so then, after this recognition is made, and we're all justifiably horrified, Dionysus appears in the form of a god, and appears as a god on stage, which is the first time it's actually happened. He's only been in human disguise on stage, and his voice of the god has been heard. This is the first time he's been seen as a god on stage for the play, and he sends everybody on to different exiles. He will not kill them, but none of them could stay in Thebes. Cadmus and Agave both sorrowfully accept their exiles, realizing they have made some mistakes, and none of them really want to be there anyways, because they kind of tore their own family apart. Quite literally. So Agave heads off to find her sister so they can go in exile together, and Cadmus heads off supposedly with his wife. She's in that exile as well, though we haven't seen her in the entire play. She's apparently a daughter of Ares, the god of war, so maybe didn't go mad, but we haven't seen her. She's included in the exile though, and they're heading off together. And the chorus ends the play extremely briefly by saying that the gods can create impossible circumstances, so if something like this doesn't sound like it could happen, it can with the gods. Yeah, I mean, that's a... and they all lived happily ever after ending, isn't it? No. No, it's not. Okay, so I will, again, make a textual note at the beginning of this chapter to note that the translators have noticed there's pieces missing, and this is probably true of most translators. There's two bigger sections missing out of the end of the Bacchae, where we skip Agave weeping over her son a bit, which is what this section is, and oddly enough, a big part, probably a large part, of Dionysus's appearance and discussion when he sends Agave and her sisters into exile, because we only have him sending Cadmus into exile, but following that point, Agave is also going into exile with her sisters, separate from her father, so we can assume Dionysus originally said something to her prior to this point. Besides, his speech is a little weird because he doesn't, yeah, I did it because you deserved it type thing from the start. We go right into him sending Cadmus out, so we're definitely missing some parts of the script. I mention that because, one, again, we can generally fill things out for what happened following what happened afterwards. Agave says she's going into exile because she has to. It's separate from her father. We can assume Dionysus probably mentioned that. But the other thing you need to keep in mind is then in performances, some people might have created sections and filled those sections in to make up for the fact that they're missing from the original manuscript. So just be aware of that. If you're suddenly just like, I'm not sure that was in the original text, if it was one of those spots, it's because for performance's sake they're trying to smooth over those gaps. And this does happen more often than we would like to. I think the big one is the Epic of Gilgamesh, that is infamous for its square bracket gaps, which include the death of a main character that just is nowhere there anymore. His friends are just mourning him, and then Gilgamesh goes off on a solo quest for immortality because his friend died. Not that you saw that. So, older manuscripts, unfortunately, that's just what tends to happen. Which is why, also, like I said, we have a few Greek tragedies and Greek comedies, but we certainly know there was a lot more performed than what came down to us. So, with that textual note aside, let's talk about what actually occurred in this chapter. Which is to say, well, if we felt good about Pentheus dying the previous scene, maybe seeing his mother proudly talk about hunting him is starting to make us feel a little squiggly inside. Especially when the chorus goes beyond celebrating their possible safety to extremely heartless in this. They're literally goading this woman on to brag about killing her son. And, like, they recognize it's a terrible thing, because they hint several times that, like, yes, you've hunted much sorrow. Like, you'll reap what you've sown. Like, they know full well this is a terrible thing. And they're just probing this poor woman on. So, the chorus starts losing some sympathy. And for the most part, again, the chorus actually disappears for much of the scene once Cadmus comes in. Which is a very interesting thing, because we suddenly have this turn from the chorus representing how the audience should feel to the strong possibility that Cadmus really is who we should be understanding. And the chorus does pop in and says sort of the exact same thing when they say, I feel for you, Cadmus, but that grandson of yours deserved his punishment, painful as it is for you. So we do have this allowable change of perspective to the view of Cadmus, which is, my family has been destroyed. We made mistakes, and my family has been destroyed for it. But before we get to that part fully, we need to talk about the end of Agave's madness. And that's the interesting thing with these types of Bacchic rituals, is we can assume that the end of the festival means that everybody just goes back to normal. But we also have to recognize that sometimes that means people are dead, and there is no normal to go back to. So what actually happens here is very family-oriented deed madness thing. That's just, oh god, that was a terrible word to choose. Agave comes out of her madness, and we can't assume it's because Dionysus has allowed her to come out of this madness, because it is a Bacchic madness that he's created. Yet, she doesn't do it right away, and she does not do it on her own. Like, several people, like Cadmus and the chorus, reference that, like, when you realize what's happened, you're going to hate yourself. But that doesn't make her think something's wrong here. It is Cadmus directly talking her out of her madness that actually results in her coming to her own head. And if you actually follow the path of the conversation, it is a weird path that Cadmus takes for his daughter to realize what she's done. Which is to say that he starts by asking her to look up at the sky. So why does Agave have to recognize first the sky before she can recognize herself? Because there is something of Agave reflected in that sky. Her soul, her soul, her mind, and her senses are mentioned rapidly after her recognition of the sky. So there's something about her soul, her mind, and her senses that are reflected in the sky. Okay, so we're definitely into probably metaphor territory, but it's a question of a metaphor of what? Is she recognizing something of herself in nature in its proper forms, not the twisted, weird nature of the Bacchic rituals? Or is she recognizing herself as part of the gods? Because we have had the gods associated with the sky several times throughout this play, and it is a pretty common association. High places, at least, if not the sky. So, is Agave recognizing her image as an image of the gods from the sky that she can then start recognizing herself? But there's something about the sky that needs to be recognized first. Then Cadmus is able to start connecting Agave with her relations. Agave calls him father and says something is changing. And I can't remember what we were talking about. So we get the father connection. Then we get her husband, because Cadmus asks her who she was married to. And then asks about her son. So we get this community recognition alongside this spiritual recognition from the sky to oneself, to one's community. And it is sort of this weird thing that we need to follow. Both nature and the God connection both work for then connecting to community, right? Community is natural, ordained by the gods. So, Agave recognizes the sky, starts to recognize herself and her community, but she does not immediately recognize what she is holding. In fact, when she can identify her father, her husband, and her son, Cadmus asks what she's holding, and she says it is the head of a lion. At least that's what the hunters told me. Because she doesn't want to admit that truth. She's starting to suspect something. She's starting to suspect she's been misled. But the truth is a terrible one. So if she can continue to fool herself, she doesn't have to face the fact that she's holding her son's head. But she's already past that point. Because she has recognized the sky, herself, and her community. And it's become this weird thing where she's trying to figure out, are the hunters part of my community? And what am I holding? And Cadmus does not let her turn away from this. She started to realize it, but if Cadmus is not here to continue speaking to her, she could fool herself into not a Bacchic madness, but probably some sort of outright madness, to deny the horror that she is becoming tangentially aware of. But Cadmus does not let her do that. He forces her not only to recognize that she is in fact holding Pentheus's head, but he also forces her to know the full truth, which is to say that she herself helped to kill her son Pentheus. And that is something that he very specifically does. He does not let her think that somebody else has done this. She asks who's done this, and he says, "This will hurt you, but it was you." And this is sort of an interesting play with truth, because we're having this terrible truth that has to be recognized, but as we mentioned before, we've also got these truths that the Bacchic madness seems to bring out. These odd connections that can be made if inhibitions are taken away. Connections to animals, connections to nature, connections to one's own violence. So, the madness showed Agave's ability to be violent. And coming out of that madness showed the consequences of that. So, the full return from the Bacchic madness for Agave means accepting these two truths together. That there are extreme consequences for violence that she herself committed. And this is a really interesting image, because this image might actually start allowing us to understand why the events of this play had to go to their extreme. Last scene, we were very confused about how we should be feeling. Should we be upset about this? Was this too much? Should we be celebrating this? But this scene really helps to consolidate the tragedy aspect that becomes then inevitable. Because we do have Cadmus push back against Dionysus here and saying that he was too angry and he went too far. But Dionysus right away says that this was ordained by Zeus, the head god. And that has to be something to be accepted. The gods meant for this to happen in the way that it did for a reason. And that might make us feel terrible, but we then have to try and discover the reason behind it. And what I pulled from this particular reasoning, and this particular reading of the play, was this need to admit to and accept deeply, deeply uncomfortable and terrible truths. Because what we're actually seeing here in this scene is a want for humans to lie to themselves that has snowballed out of control. And this started from the very beginning, that lie about Dionysus being a child of Zeus. And the fact that the Theban royal family told themselves that their sister slept around and then lied, rather than admit that she did in fact sleep with Zeus and have a child with him, was a lie that they told themselves that again got far too out of control. Humans are very willing to lie to themselves about a lot of things, especially ones that don't always compute or make us feel small. How then did Semelea's sisters feel when she was the one chosen by a god rather than them? Especially considering that Actaeon is another grandson of this family. So a man who has already died prior to this play, who was torn apart by his own dogs because he saw Artemis naked. How do they feel of their family having previously been attacked by a god, then having a member sleep with a god and then produce a child. These are uncomfortable truths that this family didn't want to face, and thus rejected and lied to themselves about it. So what actually happens then is they're forced to face the truth in a very, very tangible way. Agave cannot lie to herself about the death of her son. She is holding his head, and her father, Pentheus' grandfather, has collected the body. And then even Cadmus has to admit that Pentheus went too far in lacking faith in the gods. He can't lie to himself about that. He has to recognize, I loved you, and you've died horribly, but you made mistakes. And that's not always something that we want to do as human beings. We'd much rather clear all the bad stuff out and focus only on the good, rather than admit that people are very complicated and sometimes not good people. And that can be really hard because for our own mental health, a lot of times we have to do that. Well, what this play is saying is that you can't. The gods get involved, but the gods only get involved insofar as to force humans to recognize their own nature and their own need to lie to themselves to survive, and how that is, in often ways, more destructive and more self-destructive than admitting the truth. And it's not just it happens once and then you figure it all out. All of the members of this royal family are now going into exile. Even Cadmus, who came to accept Dionysus as a god and even joined his festivities, still needs to go into exile. He will continue making mistakes and having to admit that. Because humans are not moments. We are a continuing timeline within ourselves and then within the greater humanity. So a single human might be a moment in the greater humanity, but you don't halfway through life figure out, bing, I am perfect. I have made all of my mistakes. I recognize those mistakes. I make no more mistakes from here on out. That's not how this works. So what's actually happened here is that even though this family has been forced to recognize the truth, they've also been sent out to continue making mistakes and to continue to find the truth. Does that make us feel good? No. This is a tragedy. This is supposed to make us pity this family and weep. And it is supposed to make us afraid for ourselves. Because while we might not have a god show up out of nowhere and drive us mad so that we kill somebody, we certainly also have to start recognizing that a lot of times what happens in our lives has some connection to the choices we've made. That's not to say that all of it is true. But to purely blame external circumstances no longer is an option. And that is exactly what this play is saying. That this family has to accept that they are flawed human beings, their family are flawed human beings, and that had consequences that were terrible. And from here on out, they have to try and make better choices, but they will continue making mistakes because they are flawed human beings. The gods aren't all-powerful gods here. They are acting in such a way that human consequences in human nature are brought to the forefront. It is not purely the gods deciding things. There is a human aspect to it. We make mistakes. We need to admit to them. We need to accept those consequences. We can try and mitigate the consequences, but we cannot ignore them, and we cannot ignore them. In attempting to avoid and ignore them, they get worse, and a man gets torn limb from limb. So like I said, this does not leave us feeling good. A tragedy never really should. But it starts to make us wonder, how many choices do we make that will have catastrophic effects? And how much of that is our fault? So, our next play will be Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. And the reason why I bring that up is, one, we'll be switching gears into this play, and two, what happens then when we're not aware we're actually making certain choices? More people die. Yay. I'll try and do something happier after the Greek tragedy. But I'm gonna get reading Sophocles, and I hope you do too. See you next time.